Continuing on the topic of mediation, in this video we are going to run through 3 more examples of how to test for mediation using Hayes' SPSS process macro. And in these examples we will also see how to distinguish between full mediation and partial mediation. As always, I definitely recommend pausing the lecture when you feel appropriate so that you can practice doing these problems on your own. And then you'll be able to watch me walk through the solution and check your own work against mine. So in the first of the 3 examples we're going to go through, this was an environmental psychology study. They wanted to see whether anthropomorphizing social causes increases compliance. In case you're not familiar with the term anthropomorphizing, it means making something human, right? Think about anthropology, for example. So for example, an anthropomorphized advertisement might be like the one on the right, where we've humanized the trash can, whereas on the right, it's just a trash can. And you can even see this in the statements, right? Instead of saying, please put food waste in only, it says, please feed me food waste only. So we're treating the trash can kind of as if it's a person. And the idea is that anthropomorphic advertisements like the one on the left are more likely to get people to comply with environmental efforts and recycling and that sort of stuff. So in this particular paper, they did a series of studies. In the first study, they were trying to look at people's compliance with turning off lights that they're not using so as not to waste energy. And each person saw one of the following 2 advertisements, either the non-anthropomorphic one, which just said, our bulbs are burning hot, turn the lights off when you leave, or they saw the anthropomorphized light bulb, which said, I'm burning hot, turn me off when you leave. And what they found is that compliance was indeed higher when they saw the sad-looking light bulb as opposed to the light bulb that was just presented as an object. And they conclude this write-up by saying, you know, this is an interesting finding and it's encouraging, but it's limited because we didn't actually test the mechanism. We didn't test why this happens. So in study 2, they wanted to go a step further and not only demonstrate that anthropomorphizing causes increases compliance, but also look at potential mediators of that relationship. In other words, why exactly does anthropomorphizing causes increase compliance? So in study 2, they used those stimuli that I showed you on the previous slide, either the anthropomorphic trash can or the regular trash can, and they predicted that they would replicate study 1, finding that anthropomorphic ads increased compliance, but they wanted to know about a potential mediator of this relationship. And the mediator that they identified was anticipated guilt. In other words, their hypothesis was that when a person saw a sad-looking trash can, they anticipated that they would feel more guilty if they were to not recycle. And in turn, when they thought they would feel guilty, it made them more likely to comply. So this anticipated guilt variable is the mediator that they proposed as a potential explanation for why these ads tend to be more effective. This coefficient here, the 0.79, that would be your C value on your diagram. Okay, the indirect effect was significant, and we know that because the confidence interval for the indirect effect did not include 0. So the indirect effect is equal to 0.46. That's something we're certainly going to want to report in our results. And the bootstrapped confidence interval stretched from 0.13 to 0.78. So since 0 does not fall between these 2 numbers, we know that the indirect effect was significant. I don't have it on this slide, but earlier in the output, we could find the values of A and B, which you'll need to include in your diagram. If we were to multiply A times B, we would get 0.46, which is the value of our indirect effect. So again, just to reiterate, the indirect effect is always equal to A times B. Next question, was this full mediation or a partial mediation? To tell, we need to look at the difference between the total effect and the indirect effect. In this case, the total effect was significant, but then the direct effect was not. In other words, when we factored in the mediator, the direct effect wasn't significant anymore. P equals 0.13. So anytime we see a significant total effect paired with a not significant direct effect, we know that we have found complete mediation. In other words, once we account for the mediator, the relationship between x and y completely went away. So this would be full, or sometimes also called perfect, mediation. Here's how we'll write this up. First, we want to establish that the total effect was significant. So anthropomorphism was a significant predictor of compliance. In other words, when people saw the anthropomorphic advertisement, they were more likely to comply. Here's our diagram. So these two numbers we could get from the previous slide. Here's our total effect, and here's our direct effect, is 0.33. Elsewhere in the output, which wasn't on the previous slide, we could also find the values of A and B. So A in this case was 1.00 and B was 0.46. So if we multiply those together, we get an indirect effect of 0.46, which is right here. So explaining the Hayes part of the output, a bootstrapped analysis indicated that anticipated guilt fully mediated the relationship between anthropomorphism and compliance. There's the value of the indirect effect, which we can get from the previous slide, as well as the confidence interval, which is right next to it on the previous slide. So to explain this relationship, what appears to be happening here is that seeing an anthropomorphic light bulb or trash can or whatever makes people feel more guilty, or feel as if they would feel more guilty if they didn't comply. And then that guilt drives them to be compliant. Here are the actual results of the study. What's really nice about this write-up is it's a nice sort of overview of everything we've done so far. I won't read this whole paragraph to you, but you'll see that if you were to read this paragraph, the first thing they did is they tested for mediation using the old Barron and Kenny method. So they actually walked through those 3 regressions that we saw in the last lecture and checked to make sure that all of the Barron and Kenny criteria were in fact met. Then after that, they also tested for mediation using the process Hayes method. So they talk about using 5,000 bootstrap samples. They talk about the confidence interval for the indirect effect and the fact that it didn't include 0. So they actually tested for mediation both ways. They tested for it the old way and the new way. And they do a pretty good job of explaining how exactly they did that so that we can follow their logic. Realistically, this is probably overkill, but it gives a nice overview of how you could test for this for mediation in either of these 2 ways. All right, here's the second of the 3 examples that we'll discuss in this video. Does darkness cause people to behave unethically? So again, we have a series of studies here. In the first experiment, they found that people who were put in a dimly lit room, who were given the opportunity to steal money, they actually took more money than people in a well-lit room, suggesting that darkness had something to do with their decision to steal money. In a second study, they had some people wear sunglasses and some people not wear sunglasses, and then they had the opportunity to give money to another person. And they found that people who were wearing sunglasses gave less money to that other individual, so they were less generous. The question, though, is why? If darkness does influence people's behavior and causes them to be less generous or be more unethical, what's explaining that relationship? What is a potential mediator here? And then use process to give me the value as well as the confidence interval for the indirect effect. Tell me whether it includes 0 or not and what exactly that means. So if necessary, explain the nature of this relationship. So if you want to pause there, you can take a few minutes to practice this and then we'll look at it together. Okay, let's run through this. So here's how we would set up this analysis. Our X variable is whether the participant was wearing sunglasses or not. Our Y variable is generosity, which is measured as how much money they gave away to another person. And our mediator is how anonymous they felt during the study. In the options menu, the only thing we really need to do here is show the total effect model. So make sure we check that box. That way we will get all of the equations that we need to fill in our diagram and to test the 3 Barron and Kenny regressions. Here are those 3 Barron and Kenny regressions. I've trimmed out some of the output here to make it easier to read. But here we have a regression with sunglasses as a predictor of anonymity. So this would be our A path. At the bottom, we have our C path, sunglasses as a predictor of generosity or money. And in the middle, we're going to have our B and C prime paths. So there's all the relevant coefficients here. We see that sunglasses was indeed a significant predictor of anonymity. So in other words, X did in fact predict M. So the first of the 3 conditions is met. Jumping to the bottom, the second condition is met. Sunglasses did predict generosity. In other words, X did predict Y. So this p-value here tells us that the total effect, C, the total effect, was in fact significant. So the second condition is met. The third condition, however, is not completely met. So when we include both X and M, so both sunglasses and anonymity, as predictors of generosity, our outcome, if we had mediation here, what we would see is that anonymity is a significant predictor, but sunglasses is not. In fact, they're both significant. So the B path is significant, but the C prime path is also significant. We will see on the next slide what exactly that means. But if we were going strictly by the Barron and Kenny standards here, we would not be able to conclude that we have mediation in this example. If we keep going down the output, we'll see the Hayes section where we get the total effect, the direct effect, and the indirect effect. Jumping down to the indirect effect, here's the value of the indirect effect. We could also calculate this number by using A and B from the previous slide and multiplying A times B. Or we could just get it from right here, which is obviously easier. Here is the confidence interval for our indirect effect, which, as you can see, both numbers are negative, so this confidence interval does not include 0. This tells us that we have a significant indirect effect. Now, the next thing we have to figure out is, do we have full mediation or do we have partial mediation? To figure that out, we're going to look up here at the total and direct effects. The total effect is significant, of course, but the direct effect is also significant. So the effect got weaker, right? You can see that C prime is clearly much less than C, but the C prime path is still significant. So this is an instance where we have partial mediation rather than complete mediation. If this relationship had completely gone away, we would have full mediation. But this relationship is still significant. That's how we know we have partial mediation. So here's how we'd write this up. As always, we have our diagram with our 4 coefficients on it, our A path, B path, C, and C prime. Using the Barron and Kenny method, we found evidence of partial mediation. Darkness predicted greater anonymity, so X predicted M. Darkness also predicted less generosity, so X predicted Y. But then when we included both predictors, both of them were significant. However, darkness was a less strong predictor than it was before. So the direct effect of darkness was considerably less than the total effect of darkness. This is a situation, you might remember me briefly mentioning this in the last video. This is a situation where you would want to perhaps use a Sobel test to make sure that the decrease from C to C prime was a significant decrease. Although if you just use Hayes's method, the need to use that test goes away. So it's becoming increasingly common for people to just use Hayes and not use Barron and Kenny at all. Speaking of which, here's how we'd report the results for the Hayes portion. A bootstrapped analysis showed an indirect effect of darkness on generosity through anonymity. So here's the exact value of the indirect effect, and here's the bootstrapped confidence interval, which again does not include 0. And if we want to explain that, we know that darkness increased anonymity, right? Because A is positive, darkness increased anonymity. B is negative, telling us that anonymity decreased generosity. So there is an indirect effect of darkness on generosity. As predicted, darkness made people feel more anonymous, which in turn made them less generous. Let's see how the authors reported their own mediation analysis. Just like the other paper, actually, they first used the Barron and Kenny method, and they reported all 3 of those Barron and Kenny regressions, and they even cite Barron and Kenny there. And they found that the conditions were largely met. And then they did a bootstrap analysis. So they used Hayes's method. They found that the confidence interval did not include 0, suggesting that the indirect effect was, in fact, significant. Here's the third example that we will see in this video today, and the final example that we'll see. They used speed dating, kind of a creative thing, maybe not so common anymore, but a creative way of collecting data from people, to test whether people who are depressed tend to be more likely to be rejected by others. And their hypothesis was that this is actually somewhat of a self-fulfilling prophecy, that people who are depressed, their depression actually rubs off on other people, which causes those other people to reject them. So again, in this study, they used 136 speed daters, and their prediction was that person A, we're just going to call this person A here, person A's level of depressive symptoms would be a negative predictor of person B's attraction to person A. So after each of these dyadic interactions, I guess they asked person B to self-report the degree to which they were attracted to person A. And what they predicted is that the more depressed person A was, the less that person B would be attracted to person A. So this is your X variable. This is your predictor, the depressive symptoms exhibited by person A. This is your Y variable, your outcome, person B's attraction to person A. Now, these authors not only wanted to demonstrate that this happens, but they also wanted to explain why it might happen by testing a potential mediator, namely person B's positive affect. In other words, if person A is kind of a downer, that rubs off on person B, and person B starts to feel less positive affect themselves. And the less positive affect you feel toward a person, the less likely you are to be attracted to them, or vice versa. So what they would hypothesize here is that the more depressed person A is, the less positive affect their conversation partner will feel. And in turn, the less positive affect their conversation partner feels, the less they'll be attracted to person A. The 4 relevant coefficients. So if you want to pause here and practice this problem, go ahead and do that now, and then I will walk you through it. Okay, let's but I think people might disagree, about what exactly to call this. Here is your diagram, and here is an explanation of the results. Again, we're just using Hayes's method here. So overall, the total effect actually wasn't significant. So depression was not a significant predictor of a person's attractiveness. But the indirect effect was significant. So this is a good example of exactly what Hayes was talking about in the paper that he wrote in 2009, saying that even if you don't have a significant total effect, you can still have a significant indirect effect. There's still something interesting happening here. So what the results of the analysis show is that person A's level of depression did actually predict lower levels of positive affect in their conversation partner, which in turn made them less attractive to their conversation partner. Jumping back for just a second, in the next lecture, we will talk about how you can have multiple mediators in the same model. So just looking at this top model, for example, they would have predicted that depressive symptoms would have influenced both positive and negative affect, and both of those things combined would have impacted a person's attraction to the original, to person A. So we're going to talk about how exactly you can test multiple mediators using the same model, actually, model 4.